Okay, chapter 2. His mother was singing in the kitchen. He could hear her singing there, and the sound of her voice was the sound of home. She sang the same tune over and over again. She never sang the words to it, just the tune in a kind of absent voice, as if she were thinking of something else and the singing were only a way of killing time. When she was busiest, she always sang. It was the fall of the year. The poplars in the cottonwoods had turned red and yellow. His mother was working and singing in the kitchen over the old coal burning stove. She was stirring apple butter in a big crock, or she was canning peaches. The peaches sent a rich, spicy smell through the whole house. She was making jelly. The pulp from the fruit hung in a flour sack over the cooler part of the stove. Through the cloth, the juices oozed stickily down into a pan. The pan had a thick pinkish cream scum around its edges. In the center, the juice was clear and red. She was baking bread. She baked bread twice a week. She kept a jar of starter in the icebox from baking time to time. No, she was baking bread. She baked bread twice a week. She kept a jar of starter in the icebox from baking time to baking time, so she never had to worry about yeast. The bread was heavy and brown, and sometimes it swelled 2 or 3 inches over the top of the pan. When she took it out of the oven, she smeared the brown crust with butter and let it cool. But even better than the bread were the rolls. She baked them to come out of the oven just before supper. They were steaming hot, and you put butter inside them and it melted, and then you put jam on them or apricot preserves with nuts in the syrup. That was all you wanted for supper, although you had to eat other things, of course. On summer afternoons, you took a thick slice of the bread and put cold butter on it. Then you sprinkled sugar over the butter, and that was better than cake. Or you got a thick slice of sweet Bermuda onion and put it between 2 slabs of bread and butter, and nobody anywhere in the world had anything more delicious to eat. Or you got a thick slice of sweet Bermuda onion and put it between 2 slabs of bread and butter, and nobody anywhere in the world had anything more delicious to eat. In the fall, his mother worked from day to day and from week to week, scarcely ever getting out of the kitchen. She canned peaches and cherries and raspberries and blackberries and plums and apricots and made jams and jellies and preserves and chili sauces. And while she worked, she sang. She sang the same hymn in an absent voice without words, as if she were thinking of something else all the while. There was a hamburger man down on Fifth and Main. He was slight and stooped and pasty-faced and always glad to talk with anyone who stopped by his stand. He was the only hamburger man in Shell City, so he had a monopoly on the business. People said he was a dope fiend and that sometime he would get dangerous, but he never did, and he made the best hamburgers anyone ever ate. He had a gas flare over his gas plate, and you could smell the wonderful odor of onions frying there for a block on either side of his stand. He came out about 5 or 6 in the afternoons and made hamburgers until 10 or 11. You had to wait if you wanted a sandwich. His mother loved the hamburger man's sandwiches. On Saturday nights, his father worked late at the store. He would go downtown on Saturday nights and wait until his father got his paycheck. At about 9:45, when the store was getting ready to close, his father would give him 30 cents for 3 hamburgers. He would rush with his money over to the hamburger man to get a place in line. He would order 3 hamburgers to go with lots of onions and sweet mustard. By the time the order was filled, his father would already be on the way home. The hamburger man would put the sandwiches in a bag, and he would put the bag inside his shirt next to his body. Then he would run all the way home so that the hamburgers would still be warm. He would run through the sharp autumn nights, feeling the heat of the hamburgers next to his stomach. Each Saturday night he tried to beat last Saturday's time so the sandwiches would be even warmer. He would get home and pull them out of his shirt front, and his mother would eat one right away. By that time his father would be home too. It was a great Saturday night feast. The girls would be in bed being so young, and it seemed to him that he had his father and mother completely to himself. He was in a way grown up. He envied the hamburger man because the hamburger man could have all the sandwiches he wanted. In the fall, the snow came. Usually there was snow for Thanksgiving, but sometimes it didn't come until middle December. The first snowfall was the most wonderful thing on earth. His father always waked him early, his voice booming out about the snow. It was usually a wet snow, and it clung to everything it touched. Even the wire fence around the chicken coop in the backyard would hold the snow, maybe a half-inch deep. The chickens never stopped being puzzled and alarmed about the first snow. They would walk carefully in it and shake their feet, and the roosters would talk about it complainingly all day long. The outbuildings were always beautiful, and a fence post would have a cap 4 inches high. The birds in vacant lots would make little patterns in the snow, crossed up once in a while by a rabbit track. His father never failed to wake him early when the snow fell. First he rushed to the window to look, then he got into his heavy clothes and his mackinaw and his boots and his sheepskin gloves and took his flexible flyer and went out with the rest of the kids and didn't come back till his feet were numb and his nose was frosty. The snow was a wonderful thing. In the spring there were prim roses all over the vacant lots. They opened in the morning and closed when the sun grew hot, and then opened again in the evening. Each evening the kids went on primrose hunts. They brought back great bouquets of white flowers as big as your hand and put them in flat bowls of water. On May Day they made baskets and filled them with primroses, hiding a little candy beneath the flowers. When it was dark, they went from house to house and left a basket and knocked on the door and ran away fast into the night. Lincoln Beachy came to town. Lincoln Beachy came to town. It was the first airplane Shell City ever saw. They had it in a tent in the middle of the racetrack over in the fairgrounds. Day in and day out, people filed through the tent looking at it. It seemed to be all wire and cloth. People couldn't understand how a man would risk his life just on the strength of a wire. One little wire gone wrong and it meant the end of Lincoln Beachy. Away up in front of the plane ahead of the propellers was a little seat with a stick in front of it. That was where the great aviator sat. Everyone in Shell City was pleased with the idea of Lincoln Beachy coming to town. It was a wonderful thing. Shell City was really becoming a metropolis. Lincoln Beachy didn't stop at every little stick in the mud town. He stopped only in places like Denver and Shell City and Salt Lake, and he was going on to San Francisco. The whole town turned out the day Lincoln Beachy looped the loop. He did it 5 times. It was the damnest thing anybody ever saw. Mr. Hargraves, who was superintendent of schools, made a speech before the flight. He told about how the invention of the airplane was the greatest step forward man had made in 100 years. The airplane, said Mr. Hargraves, would cut down the distance between nations and peoples. The airplane would be a great instrument in making people understand one another and making people love one another. The airplane, said Mr. Hargraves, was ushering in a new era of peace and prosperity and mutual understanding. Everyone would be friends, said Mr. Hargraves, when the airplane knitted the world together so that the people of the world understood each other. After the speech, Lincoln Beachy looped the loop 5 times and left town. A couple months later, his airplane fell into San Francisco Bay and Lincoln Beachy was drowned. Shell City felt as if it had lost a resident. The Shell City Monitor ran an editorial and said that even though the great Lincoln Beachy was dead, the airplane, the instrument of peace, the knitter together of peoples, would go on. His birthday fell in December. Each birthday his mother cooked a big dinner and he had his friends over to the house. Each of his friends also had birthday dinners, so there were at least 6 big affairs during the year for the guys to get together. They usually had chicken and there was always a birthday cake and ice cream. The guys all brought presents. He would never forget the time Glenn Hogan brought him a pair of brown silk socks. That was before he had long trousers. The socks seemed to mean a step forward in a grown-up future. They were very handsome. After the party, he put them on and stared at them for a long while. He got the long pants to go with them 3 months later. The guys all liked his father probably because his father liked the guys. After the dinner was over, his father always took them all to a show. They would put on their mackinaws and go outside into the snow and tramp down to the Elysium Theater. It was great feeling warm on the inside from food and your face cold on the outside from zero air and a show to look forward to. He could hear their footsteps squeaking in the snow even now. He could see his father leading the pack down to the Elysium. He remembered that the shows were always good. In the fall there was the county fair. There were bucking broncos and steers to be bulldogged and bareback Indian races and trotting races. There was always a bunch of Indians headed by the great squaw, Chippewa. A street in Shell City was named after her. The town of Ouray, Colorado, had been named after Chief Ouray, her husband. The Indians Chippewa brought with her didn't do much but squat around and stare, but Chippewa herself was full of smiles and talk about the early days. A carnival came to town during the fair, and you could see women cut in half and motorcycle riders defying death inside a straight up and down circular wall. In the main auditorium of the fairgrounds, there were canned fruits gleaming through mason jars and displays of embroidery and rows of cakes and piles of bread and huge squashes and extra fancy potatoes. In the livestock pens, there were steers that looked as square as an outhouse and pigs almost as big as cows and thoroughbred chickens. Fair Week was the biggest week of the year. In a way, it was even bigger than Christmas. You bought whips with tassels on the ends, and it was a mark of favor if you flicked the legs of a girl you liked. There was a smell about the fairgrounds you never forgot, a smell you never ceased dreaming of. He would always smell it somewhere back in his mind as long as he lived. In the summer, they went out to the big ditch north of town and stripped off their clothes and lay around on its banks and talked. The water would be warm from the summer air, and the heat would be rising off the brown gray land like steam. They would swim for a little while, then they would go back on the bank and sit around all naked and tan and talk. They would talk about bicycles and girls and dogs and guns. They would talk about camping trips and rabbit hunting and girls and fishing. They would talk about the hunting knives they all wanted but only Glenn Hogan had. They would talk about girls. When they came of it, when they came of an age to take girls out on dates, they always took them to the pavilion in the fairgrounds. They began to get very dressy. They talked about ties with matching handkerchiefs, and they wore brogue shoes and shirts that had bright red and green and yellow stripes in them. Glenn Hogan had 7 silk shirts. He had most of the girls too. It got to be an important matter whether or not you had a car, and it was a very humiliating thing to walk your girl to the pavilion. Sometimes you didn't have enough money to go to the dance, so you would drive lazily by the fairgrounds and hear the music coming through the night from the pavilion. The songs all had meaning and the words were very serious. You felt all swelled up inside and you wished you were over there at the pavilion. You wondered who your girl was dancing with. Then you would light a cigarette and talk about something else. It was quite a thing to light a cigarette. You only did it at night when nobody would see you. You made a serious business of holding the cigarette in a properly careless fashion. And the first guy in the bunch able to inhale was the greatest guy on earth until the rest caught up with him. Down at Jim O'Connell's cigar store, the old men sat around and talked about the war. O'Connell's was very cool in the back room. Before Colorado went dry, it was a saloon, and it still had the smell of beer in the floorboards on damp days. The old men sat there on high chairs and watched the pool tables and spat into big brass spittoons and talked about England and France and in the end about Russia. Russia was always on the point of starting a big offensive. Russia was always on the point of starting a big offensive that would push the goddamn Germans right back on Berlin. That would be the end of your war. Then his father decided to leave Shell City. They went to Los Angeles. There he became conscious for the first time about the war. He waked to the war when Romania entered. It seemed very important. He had never heard of Romania except in geography classes, but the entry of Romania into the war occurred on the same day the Los Angeles newspapers carried a story of 2 young Canadian soldiers who had been crucified by the Germans in full view of their comrades across no man's land. No man's land. That made the Germans nothing better than animals, and naturally you got interested and wanted Germany to get the tar kicked out of her. Everybody talked about the oil wells and the wheat fields of Romania and how they would supply the Allies and how this surely was the end of the war. But the Germans walked right through Romania and they took Bucharest, and Queen Marie had to leave her palace. Then his father died and America entered the war and he had to come too, and here he was. He lay and thought, oh, Jojo, this is no place for you. It was no war for you. He lay and thought, oh, Jojo, this is no place for you. This was no war for you. This thing wasn't any of your business. What do you care about making the world safe for democracy? All you wanted to do, Joe, was to live. You were born and raised in the good, healthy country of Colorado, and you had no more to do with Germany or England or France or even with Washington, D.C. than you had to do with the man in the moon. Yet here you are, and it was none of your affair. Here you are, Joe, and you're hurt worse than you think. You're hurt bad. Maybe it would be a lot better if you were dead and buried on the hill across the river from Shell City. Maybe there are more things wrong with you than you suspect, Joe. Or why the hell did you ever get into this mess anyhow? Because it wasn't your fight, Joe. You never really knew what the fight was all about. Okay, so they're just bringing the story together, little by little. Chapter 2, y'all. Peace.